98%. That's how much of the meat in this country comes from factory farms. Not the sunny pastures you see on the label, not the happy animals grazing in open fields. Concrete buildings, concentrated manure, and pollution that's seeping into the water millions of Americans drink every day. Ken Swensen has spent 15 years digging into the data most people never see. He runs Inside Animal Ag, a research-based guide that tracks the real impacts of industrial animal agriculture on our water, our land, and our health. Today, he's here with a claim that might surprise you. Factory farming is the primary driver of water pollution in the United States, and the damage goes far beyond what most of us realize. This is Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. Let's join the conversation between Dr. Lieberman and Ken about what's really in your water.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. I'm Dr. Johnny Lieberman, and here today on the show, I am pleased to welcome Ken Swensen. Ken, thanks so much for joining today.
Great, Johnny. Thanks. Good to be here.
So, Ken, if there were one point which you wanted to make sure that our audience did not miss today amongst everything we're going to discuss, what would that be?
I think it's that the environmental impacts of factory farming, particularly in the U.S., are significantly greater than is commonly understood. And I'm sure a lot of your audience knows some of those impacts, knows some of those damages to water, to land. We've explored some areas that we think are not as well covered as they should be. Hopefully we can share some of that today.
Great, Ken. I think that's a great starting point. Before we launch into it, perhaps you can share a bit with the audience how you know so much about this. I've looked at your website, and I think most, if not all, who review it would say you qualify as an expert in this area to talk about it based on the extensive information and research that's obvious which has been done to put together your website, Inside Animal Ag. But share a little bit about how you feel qualified to talk about this and why we should be listening to a lot of what you're talking about.
Well, starting about 15 years ago, I became very interested in factory farming. Factory farming is a system of raising animals that concentrates huge numbers in very small spaces. Generally speaking, they're raised indoors, and food is brought to them rather than them eating food on pasture or outside. The largest environmental impact probably comes from the immense amounts of manure that are created from that system. And obviously they eat very unnatural diets. They also are not able to engage in any or very few natural behaviors. I would say those are the largest, most important characteristics.
Great. Thanks for highlighting that. And I want to draw a distinction between what I think many people, I know myself included up until recently, think of when we think of farming animals for food. I think we do not think of what Ken is describing as these massive factory-like buildings where animals are crammed into really tight spaces where they could barely move, and they're fed a diet, not what their natural diet is, not what their body is meant to consume, but a diet that's convenient for the farmer, a diet full of food products which are being heavily subsidized by the taxpayer so that they're cheaper, so that they can yield a larger profit. And the consequences of the system, as we're going to get into, and first, so I want to frame that. There's almost no more of a farm, an animal that's farmed where they're roaming around free on the range, enjoying the sunlight, free to engage with their fellow animals and grazing on the grass, enjoying the sun. That's what you'll see on packages, for example, and that's what you'll see on advertisements, but that is by far the minority. The overwhelming majority of meat consumed in this country comes from this factory farm model, which Ken introduced us to, and now you know some more about. Ken, please continue.
Yeah, when you say the overwhelming majority, we put a number of 98% on that. There's no standardized definition of what is a factory farm, so we had to make our own conclusions about numbers of animals and such. But I think 98% is a pretty fair number. Unfortunately, a very large percent of consumers believe that they're not buying animal-sourced foods from factory farms because of all the misinformation and deception and confusion about labels. But yes, the overwhelming majority are raised on factory farms.
And so that's an undertone of a point there, which I want to bring up. The big agriculture companies know that consumers are often willing to pay more to buy an animal product like ground beef or bacon if they think that the animal was farmed in a humane manner before being killed. And agriculture companies know that. And so they exploit the misinformation, like you said, the lack of knowledge for most consumers to try and squeeze some more money out of them to sell them a product which was farmed on a factory farm, but it's not marketed that way. It makes the customer believe they're spending extra money to help animals, but they're really not.
All accurate. Yes. I don't have much to add to that.
Ken, you touched on environment as maybe where we're going to go first, and the downstream effects of factory farming are immense and touch almost every sector of what you can think of for the planet. It affects humans, it affects the animals, and then affects the environment, including the air we breathe, the water we drink, toxins and chemicals that leach into our water supply. The consequences are very broad, and Ken's website breaks it down extremely well in terms of the different categories you can see. It doesn't just harm the animals. It's not just a danger to human health in terms of what we eat directly. It harms the environment. Ken, you mentioned that first. Why don't you share some of what our listeners might not know about the damaging effects to our environment of this intense, abnormal, synthetic factory farm system that we have in this country?
Well, the first subject that comes to my mind is water pollution. It's an area where we have probably worked more than any other. We've done 3 deep dives, one time 3 years ago, one time 2 years ago, and one time just about 3 or 4 months ago. Many animal advocates intuitively know that industrial animal ag in the U.S. has a huge impact on water pollution. We tried to break that down and understand how important is factory farming, which I also refer to as industrial animal agriculture. How is it, in fact, the primary source of the pollution of U.S. waterways? And in our third deep dive, we had a little more. We could say with confidence for the first time that factory farming in the U.S. is the primary driver of U.S. water pollution. Now, that's a kind of a bold thing to say. We immediately got some attention from that, even from artificial intelligence. And the reason was because we filled a void. So we identified nutrient pollution as the primary driver of water pollution in the U.S. I don't think that's a controversial discovery. We took the next step of trying to determine how much nutrient pollution comes from industrial animal agriculture.
Share with our audience what you mean by nutrient pollution, examples of nutrients, and why damage they cause if you consume them.
So nutrient pollution is one of the so-called 9 planetary boundaries, beyond which, when we move beyond those boundaries, we actually put the health of the earth at risk. Nutrient pollution, i.e. the excess of nitrogen and phosphorus in the environment from industrial animal agriculture, comes from manure, and it comes from excess fertilizers on feed crops. So whenever we consider the impacts of animal ag, as we call it, generally speaking, those are the 2 largest sources: feed crops and manure, concentrated manure, which we spoke about before.
So manure and fertilizer are getting into our water supply routinely. Is that correct?
Yes, routinely. It is built in to the system. It's built in because of the concentration of manure, and it's built in because of the immense use of fertilizers, especially on feed crops, corn, soy, alfalfa, hay. When we have too much nutrients in water, mostly coming from manure and excess fertilizers, it creates conditions that are not conducive to normal biological life. In fact, the EPA says that the key metric of water health is biological condition, i.e., how many normal living things are there, and the effects of nutrient pollution on biological condition are extreme. That has impacts in many different places. Biodiversity, for example, aquatic species in the U.S. are the most threatened species. One of the main reasons for that is nutrient pollution. And one of the main reasons for that, in fact, the primary cause, we claim, of nutrient pollution is industrial animal agriculture.
So it affects our waterways, our drinking water, and marine life, correct? That's what you're referring to, fish and other marine life?
Yeah, freshwater animals as well as dead zones in coastal areas. When you speak of marine life, nutrient pollution is the key cause of the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, along with most dead zones. And that nutrient pollution that is in the Gulf of Mexico comes mostly from industrial animal agriculture, from manure and excess fertilizer on feed crops. To just shift to another impact of factory farming that we think is not well known.
All right, so then look, before we move on, Ken, let's talk about, so nitrates and phosphates in our water supply. What are some of the human adverse health effects of that? Why is that such a concern? And fertilizer, for that matter.
Well, we just put up a page on nitrates and human health about 2 weeks ago, so that's a good subject for me to talk about.
Go.
It took about 3 weeks to, we not only have to understand the subject on its own, but then we have to look at it through the lens of animal agriculture. And I'll just step back for a moment and say that lens is sometimes very unclear. Agriculture in general is viewed as such a benefit, as it should be, to society, that there's such a thing called agricultural exceptionalism, which is basically saying, well, yes, all these damages are happening, but it's so important and we have to have our food that we have to let farmers do X, Y, and Z. We can't get around it. Then industrial animal agriculture benefits from that because not only are researchers and certainly federal agencies less intent on identifying the damages from agriculture, they are even more less intent on digging down into the impacts of animal agriculture. So that's the lens that we try to look through. When it comes to nitrates, Johnny, the biggest impact on nitrates is on people who have wells in rural areas. The EPA has set a level of 10 mg per L, milligrams per liter, for nitrates in drinking water. There are many, many people who are drinking water with nitrates higher than that level and don't know. They don't test their water. Many people in rural areas, they don't have the resources. They haven't learned about nitrates. The EPA estimated, or maybe it was the USGS, I think, estimated just a couple of years ago that about 1.5 million people in this country are drinking water in excess of, I believe it's that 10 mg per L. But the point is, even at 5 mg per L, half of the EPA's contaminant limit, there are damages. And like most what we'll call negative externalities of animal agriculture, they are transfer from corporations to people who are very often unidentified, very often unsuspecting. So these high nitrate levels are relatively common in private wells, and they're sometimes not well known. So where do they come from? all the regular places. They come from concentrated manure on factory farms. They come from excess fertilizer on feed crops. And the causes, you asked what kinds of damages do they cause? There's lots of very sad things that happen. The blue baby syndrome is the best known of those, but there is also a great deal of evidence. But most researchers would say that many cancer cases are coming from nitrate pollution. Many birth defects are coming from nitrate pollution. That transfer of pollution from corporations to people is one of the many negative externalities of animal agriculture.
Multiple kinds of cancer have been epidemiologically linked to consumption of nitrates. So it's a toxic chemical that's leaking out into the water supply of many, and it's not common knowledge. It's important for the security of the country. It's a basic role of government. I think governments across the world agree, and I think most people would agree that that's a basic duty of government to provide food for its people. If not, that leads to rebellions throughout history, governments getting overthrown if you can't feed your people. However, there's a big caveat to that. Factory farming is not the only way to feed your people. In fact, but it's by far not the most efficient way to feed your people because of a variety of factors. The amount of calories, the amount of food that has to be grown to produce, for example, a pound of beef, the amount of water used, the amount of food that crops that could be put in to produce more food and calories for humans, the numbers just don't make sense. So while the agriculture exceptionalism is a common narrative that we hear, there's also an important caveat you need to take in mind that it's, yes, you have to feed your people, and yes, you have to invest in that, but this isn't the only way to do it.
Yes, I'll certainly jump onto that and say, according to our calculation, about 55% of U.S. croplands grows food for animals.
More than half. I've seen graphics of this, and it might even be on your site as well, showing if you show a map of the U.S., it's just stunning. Seeing it, in my opinion, seeing it visually, the amount of cropland not dedicated to growing crops to feed our population, but it's to feed animals. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, we actually import more than half of our fruits. And I think the number is about maybe 35% of our vegetables. But we export huge amounts of soybeans and corn. So it's kind of a funny thing. And of course, we export them mostly for animal feed. So this idea of feeding the world in the U.S. has kind of been turned on its head. Yeah. So it's not just cropland. About 35% of the contiguous U.S. is used for grazing, so more than a third. And that's as the primary use is grazing. If you include secondary use, like in forests, it's actually higher than that. So the massive use of resources, and since you mentioned water consumption, Johnny, according to our calculation, about 40% of total U.S. water consumption is attributed to U.S. factory farming. To me, that's an astonishing number. We spent a lot of time trying to zero in on that number. 38% of that 40% is for feed crops. That's where our water goes. It's the biggest use of water in the nation. And that's just calculating the amounts of corn and soybeans and alfalfa that are specifically going to animal feed. That's not counting all corn and soybeans. So when I say 40% is going specifically to the factory farming system.
We're using all this land, using all this water to feed into our animal food system, our industrial animal agriculture system, as an extremely inefficient and toxic way to yield food. It's, yeah.
Well, agriculture in America is mostly for feed. We made that point, but the numbers are pretty amazing, honestly. We harvest something in the range of 310 million acres a year. Usually around 85 of that is corn. About 80 of it is soybeans. And I think about 45, something like that, is alfalfa hay. So you add up those numbers and you see that it's most of that at 310 that I mentioned. When we talk about agriculture in this country, we have to understand that we're really talking about corn, soybeans, and hay. That's really where agriculture is. And the reason those crops are so large is mostly for animal feed. Of course, we also grow corn for ethanol, as nutty as that is. We export huge amounts of soybeans, particularly, but that is mostly agriculture in America, unfortunately. And yet we don't have the land to grow, to even meet our own demand for vegetables, to meet our own demand for fruits. It's an odd situation.
Fruits and vegetables, right? And they're healthier to eat. They're healthier. Yeah. Healthier products is not necessarily the focus. Ken, so you and I chatted before coming on here, and I shared with my audience in the past my journey for getting here, which was very indirect and some of it by chance and relatively new to this world. Would you like to take a few minutes to share how you got there? I could see this is a passion of yours. You've got such great information. You put so much research and time into it. How did this become so important to you?
Yeah, thanks. I listened to your journey, and I was very moved by it. Yeah, really, really meaningful. So I've had a couple of realizations in my life that kind of came from almost outside of me, and one of them was about 15 years ago. I realized that what we're doing with factory farming is such a moral abomination that I wanted to devote as much time as I could for the rest of my life to working on ending that abomination.
How'd you get there, Ken? Is there something to push you over to say this is a moral abomination? Or was it accumulation of events? A lot of people have something different that kind of got them over to say, I can't do nothing anymore. What is it for you? What did you see, learn, observe? How'd you get to that point? Because you weren't always there, I don't think.
Okay, well, thanks. That will take me back a little further then. Yeah, in my 20s, I got very involved in questions about food. I realized again, well, kind of a realization that that the diet that we were eating in America was not going to work for me, and I didn't think for anybody. But
The animal heavy diet?
the animal heavy diet, the processed food diet, I got involved in something called macrobiotics, which is a plant-based diet, and based on grains, vegetables, beans, a little bit of fish, and that was sort of my North Star for many, many years. I learned over the years, I think, a lot about health and food. I had some real mental and physical challenges back then that drove me to try to find a healthier diet. So I had a long journey of learning about food, almost abandoning animal foods, but slowly learning about factory farming. Like I said, I didn't go there because of the animals or an understanding of factory farming, but more a question of health. And I think it opened some space in me to understand slowly about factory farming, even though I wasn't too involved in it. And then, like I mentioned, I just had a realization that it particularly hit me what we were doing to pigs, to sows in gestation crates. I had a flash that I just couldn't believe that we were doing that as a society.
Doing what?
Keeping sows in these tiny gestation crates. They weigh on average about 500 pounds, and we put them in crates, as most of your listeners probably know, or many do, that are 24 inches wide. A 500-pound animal in a crate 24 inches wide. It's often said that they can't turn around. Not only can they not turn around, they can't even lie on their side. They have to lie on their belly for their entire, I think it's about 3.5 months that they spend in a gestation crate. And
So these are female pigs that are pregnant basically and putting out baby pigs to be turned into the food market, correct? That's what we're
Yes,
talking
that's
about?
right. Yes, and the farmers move them from gestation crates to farrowing crates. Farrowing crates are also the same width, but at the bottom they have a little more space, so they curve out so that the sow can lie on its side, and the piglets can eat through the bars, around the bars and through the bars. It's such a torturous system, which of course has been in the media recently because of California's mandate to get them out of these crates, which of course the pork producers are fighting desperately even now, even though it's passed and been confirmed.
Yeah, let's pause right there, Ken. That's a very important case law. Prop 12 passed in California a number of years ago, basically stating that if they're going to sell pork products in the state, they have to meet certain guidelines for space, and that would exclude these farrowing crates that can constrict them so much. Passed a law, got challenged. The Supreme Court finally said, when asked, the law stands. You can't do this in California. So that's a very brief summary of it, but it was National Pork Producers Council v. Ross. Got lots and lots of press. Many of my listeners are already familiar with it, but that is the case that Ken was referring to, landmark case, a lot of good for the animals. At risk now with current events going on, but that's another topic. Ken, please continue.
Yeah, the sows, they got to me. It might have been because I had taken an MRI just a few months previously, and I had an incredibly hard time getting through that MRI. I had to ask myself.
So why? Why is that, Ken? For those who haven't had an MRI.
I just freaked out being confined like that. I was claustrophobic. I didn't know until that time. I had to ask the gentleman who was attending to let me out and take some deep breaths. I had to do it a second time. The third time I had to just play tricks on my mind. And this confinement of animals, it reached me on a different level. Of course, it's not just sows. It's egg-laying hens in cages. It's pigs on regular feed farms, 25 pigs to the size of a small garage. This intense confinement, it's dairy cows who are often, tied or confined in one small manure-filled space.
Interesting, Ken. I really appreciate you sharing that about the MRI, how that brought it home for you. For those of you who don't know what Ken is getting at, is MRIs are, I'm sure most people have heard of them, but they're imaging devices that use magnets to image parts of the body. They give extremely detailed pictures. However, the chamber you have to lie in to get the images is very small. It's very tight. You're told not to move. You can't move. Otherwise, it compromises the image quality. But what Ken's describing is fairly common. A lot of patients who don't even know they have claustrophobia, perhaps going in there, or they're just uncomfortable with closed spaces. It brings it out. You could barely have room to take your inhale and exhale. And if you're a larger person, it's the same size you have to squeeze into. It's tougher to get into, and you might even feel more constricted. And so it's real. It's a great technology, but it comes with that downside. I just really appreciate you sharing that, Ken. I can relate as someone who's ordered many MRIs and someone who's been in them myself. And it sounds like that was an important piece for getting you to feel for these pigs, among other animals. They're in such, I mean, can you imagine, Ken, being in that for 6 months? Right. And that's, or even 3 months or even 3 hours. And these animals that are sentient beings that want to do what they want to do, they want to interact with their young, their family, their friends, move around. If they can't. Ken mentions it's not just the pigs, it's battery cages. 10 or 12 egg laying hens are confined into a super small space that they can't flap their wings, can't turn around, their feet get caught, they break their legs, they can't reach the food, they can't reach the water, and they live their entire life like that. And so that was one of my sticking points as well, or as Ken described, moral abomination. Yeah, I agree. Some people get there through different routes. So the farrowing crates for these sows, that was your turn. What pushed you over or what got you there? A moral abomination?
Yeah, yeah, the gestation crates, it just hit me at a certain moment, and I knew that what I wanted to do was just work against that for whatever time and years I had. And thankfully, my wonderful wife of 40 years, we do everything together. I hoped and prayed that she would join me on that journey, and she
Now I can see this is really, it's so emotional, Ken, and I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing all that and having a wife that's so supportive. You're a great team. It's such a great product you're putting out there. I reviewed it myself and I actually told Ken I had a paper published on topics similar to this before learning of his website. And I told him I would have loved to have this known about this before. So much good information on there. And he's arming animal lawyers, animal advocates, public policy advocates with more information to help change the system and not be living in a world where it has to be this abomination of animals to get our food. And it doesn't have to be that way.
absolutely, it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to do this. It It is unfortunately this system, in my opinion, and here I'm in opinion lands, but in my opinion, factory farming is the quintessential manifestation of our divorce from nature, that we allow ourselves to do this to animals, many of us not recognizing what a catastrophe it is because we've somehow placed ourselves above nature. We think that we can live without nature. Animals and nature, that's how we got here. That's how we're going to stay here. We haven't talked about biodiversity much, but what factory farming is doing to biodiversity on this planet, it's not just to the animals in factory
Ken,
farms.
pause here. Share what's biodiversity and why is it important?
Biodiversity is the width and breadth of all life on Earth, from little microorganisms in soil to, giant whales in the ocean, and everything that lives, plants and animals. And what we're doing on so many fronts, whether it's killing plants with pesticides throughout the Midwest, destroying the grasslands with feed crops. Grasslands are considered the rainforest of America, is the most biodiverse area, and we've destroyed more than 60% of it. All the aquatic species in freshwater and marine water. The impacts of factory farming on biodiversity are huge. But because it's so complicated, obviously just saying what biodiversity is tells you it's the single most complicated system in the world. But it's what keeps us alive. It's what cleans our water. It's what gives our soil the health to grow foods. What we've done to species in the U.S., 40% of aquatic species are threatened with extinction in the U.S., for example. Birds in the Midwest are so threatened by neonics and other pesticides. So, yeah, factory farming, unfortunately, has huge negative impacts there.
I think of it as more of a balance on the planet, is self-regulating, producing healthy, breathable air, drinkable water, and falling in the category of negative externalities. It's gradually bringing that down, so far from out of balance of what would be healthy biodiversity, healthy ecosystem to live in. Consequences across the board, as you mentioned, the flora, the fauna, humans, animals, it affects us all. And it really doesn't have to be that way. Now, you mentioned neonics in passing, and I learned about them only within the past couple of years. Didn't realize how insanely toxic they appear to be and how they're almost everywhere. Can you briefly explain what they are, why they're a concern, and they're linked to factory farming?
Sure. So neonics have kind of taken over in terms of farmers using insecticides.
So neonic stands for neonicotinoids, which
Yep.
is a class of chemicals, correct?
They're called treated insecticides. The seeds are treated so that the poison itself is within the plant. It's a relatively new methodology. At this point, I think you can say with some confidence that it is the most widely used insecticide in the US and certainly in the world.
Insecticides that contain neonicotinoids, correct?
Yes, exactly. And so when pests eat a piece of the plant, they immediately die, regardless of what part they eat, because it grows throughout the plant. Oddly enough, about 95% of the treatment itself, even though it's applied to the seed, goes into the soil, and much of it eventually goes into the water. And it's uniquely long-lived. Has a half-life, months and possibly even like a year or so. It's constantly threatening all kinds of species everywhere. Most of the treatments go on corn and soybeans. Of course, corn and soybeans are our largest crops. Corn is almost exclusively treated with neonics. Soybeans pretty much, maybe more than half, maybe even much more than that. I can't quite remember. So yeah, probably, I don't want to get the number wrong, but I think the number is about 50% of maybe 45% of neonics you can attribute directly to animal feed, something like that. Maybe that's a little high. But the point is they're uniquely damaging. A huge portion of them are used on feed crops. And most importantly, they live for a long, long time out in the environment, threatening all kinds of animals, insects, of course, birds that eat those insects, all kinds of non-target insects. We're killing all kinds of them. It's not like the neonics decide which insects are bad and which are good. No, they just pretty much kill all of them. It's pretty crazy that a blue jay, for example, that eats one corn kernel dies. So when you spread seeds, a lot of them don't go in the ground. And in fact, a lot of seeds are waste at the end of the planting season. Many farmers have too much. They don't exactly know what to do with them. It's a risk to all animals. But the point is, it has so many impacts on so many different types of animals because insects are so central to the whole biodiversity structure. They feed so many different animals, and then those animals become food for other animals, and it's kind of a chain. Yeah, it's been a while since we worked on the neonic pages. We did several pages because we thought it was that important. But again, we don't need to be growing all this animal feed. We could seriously reduce our the amounts of non-human food that we're growing if people would understand that plant-based foods are healthy and we don't need so much meat.
But wait a minute. We have the Clean Water Act. We have the Clean Air Act. Weren't these acts designed to help protect the public from air pollution, from water pollution, from exactly situations like this? Am I off on that? I feel like many in the public think, oh, well, this is being regulated. We have laws for that. I'm not too worried.
Well, the answer to that is two words: agricultural exceptionalism.
So they get a pass, right? Largely?
Yeah, they get a pass. That's right. Just recently, I spent a couple of hours on the story of regulating air emissions from factory farms. We were digging into biogas, manure biogas, and it took me on a slight detour, and it reminded me of this. It's almost so sad that it's funny, but I don't really find too many things funny in this area. But starting back, I think in 2002, 2003, the EPA started a journey to decide what emissions from factory farms, air emissions, should be regulated. That journey 24 years later, is still totally stalled. If you were to read about the ups and the downs of that journey, it would be almost like a melodrama. But the bottom line is, in the end, there are almost no regulations, even though factory farms are the source of most ammonia in this country. Ammonia leads to PM 2.5. PM 2.5 is the single most damaging air pollutant in this country as of now. If I believe I can state that with confidence.
Which has direct effect on human health when they breathe that in, correct?
Oh, absolutely. There are many studies that calculate, I shouldn't say many, there are 4 or 5 studies that calculate the number of humans, Americans, that die each year because of PM 2.5 from industrial animal agriculture. And suffice to say, it's in the many thousands. We know that ammonia from factory farms is killing people, but we don't have the wherewithal. We don't have, I don't know what to call it. We don't have the ability to even monitor it. We don't even monitor it, so no less regulate it. And as for the Clean Water Act,
And just for our listeners,
Yes.
ammonia that's in the air comes from the manure, largely, correct?
I think the number is 49% of the ammonia in the U.S. comes from manure. About 65% of the ammonia in the U.S. Comes from factory farming.
So yeah, we do have laws that exist to regulate exactly something like this, but big ag gets a pass. Agriculture exceptionalism. Many other businesses are regulated. Factory farming is not. I know there are many working on this, as you talked about the discovery over the past 24 years. That's in part because there's people pushing for it,
Yes, that's
nonprofits,
right.
and those concerned about it, trying to do good for the animals and the public at the same time. So it's because they're being pushed in part. So what can we do as concerned consumers? Can those who are worried about what we expose our children to, what we feed our family, what we do day to day for our own health, if we're not even going to talk about the environment, the animals, there's some of these negative externalities that we talked about directly affect us as people, as consumers in our environment. As we head towards our close, would you have any ideas for what people can do to protect themselves and try and help some of this?
We have control over our own food choices, our own decisions every day. And I think that's empowering. We can't do too much about the war in Iran. We can advocate, we can educate. There's lots of things we can do. But when it comes to our food choices and making a statement, we can make a statement and we can share the reasons for that statement. I moved to a vegan diet all those years ago because I wanted to protest factory farming. It wasn't because I thought it was the absolute healthiest diet. I think it is extremely healthy. I think that it has served me very, very well. But trying to find more humane options is very, very difficult, very challenging. Don't deceive yourself there. But
you mean sticking with animal products?
Yeah, sticking with animal products.
The labels are they are designed to deceive you.
That's right.
It is very hard, if not impossible, when you read a label to know the truth. And more likely than not, much more likely, as we talked about, close to 100% of the animal product meat you're going to buy comes from a factory farm. There is a little bit out there that actually was humanely raised, if you call it that. Very, very difficult to find, very hard to trust the label. Continue.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, well, we have a certain amount of control, not only in what we eat, but in what we share with our friends and family. We can have influence on people.
So you're talking about different food choices, right, Ken?
Yes, plant-based food choices, healthy plant-based food choices, whole grains and vegetables, fruits and legumes, and all the wonderful things that are out there. So yeah, we can make a statement. We can disconnect ourselves from the factory farming system. We can advocate with friends and family. We can do whatever is our calling to try and address this. I think that's empowering. The number of fabulous organizations that are out there, and we stand on their shoulders. So much of our information comes from the researchers and the nonprofits that have done this work out there. So there's so many organizations that you can get involved in and support. It's in our hands. It's a long haul. It's a big mountain. It's not going to end overnight. And we just keep showing up and try and do our best.
Thanks for bringing that home like that. The food choices you make, which are better for your health, the health of your children, the health of your family, they're also better for the animals and better for the planet. You don't have to sacrifice one. You don't have to give up something and sacrifice another part of that triangle, that one health paradigm. Animals, the way we treat animals, the way we treat environment, the health of the animals, the health of the environment are connected to our own health. You can make choices that are better for you and your family, and they're also better for the environment and animals.
Well said.
Ken, where should people go if they want to learn more information on anything we talked about today, looking it up for themselves or doing a little bit deeper dive?
Yeah, well, our website, that's what we do. It's called Inside Animal Ag, as you know. It's just at insideanimalag.org. And we've only been up a year and a month, but that's after a couple of years of work. So hopefully you'll find some things of interest there in some of those categories, whether it's environmental, worker justice, human health, and of course, animal life and treatment.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Ken. And we're about at the end now. So Ken, thank you so much for all the work you've done on that website to provide all that outstanding, solid information that so many in this space can use to do good for animals, for the planet, and for public health in general. It's a great resource, a great site. Thank you for taking time out to be on my show today. You had so much knowledge. I learned a lot here, and I know it's a lot of great information to get out to our listeners, and hopefully they'll be empowered to make decisions going forward that are better for themselves. Thanks so much, Ken.
Thank you, Johnny. Well done. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. These conversations aren't always easy, but they matter, and they're worth having. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more information, videos, and updates at johnliebermanmd.com. Take what resonates, ask questions, and keep learning. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not medical or legal advice and does not replace speaking with a qualified professional. Always seek guidance specific to your situation.